Let the men work. 3 words, spoken the way a man speaks when he has never once considered that the sentence might be wrong. Not cruel exactly, not even loud, just certain, the way gravity is certain, the way a closed door is certain. She heard them. She stepped back. She said nothing. And in that silence, in that single step backward, in the careful way she set down the diagnostic tool she had been holding, the man with the loud voice and the clean uniform and the impatient hands had made the worst miscalculation of his military career. He just didn't know it yet. My name is Old Bill, and I have been collecting stories for a long time. Stories from hangars and forward operating bases and maintenance bays at the edge of the world. Places where the wind smells like JP8 and burnt hydraulic fluid, and the particular exhaustion of men and women who have been awake too long and have too much to lose. I collect these stories because they have a pattern, and the pattern matters. The loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous one. The most dangerous person is the one who steps back, sets down the tool, says nothing, and waits. This is a story about waiting, about 14 years of it, about what a person builds in 14 years of silence and labor and flight hours in the dark, and about what happens when someone with none of those years decides to move her out of the way. Her name, for the purposes of this story, is Carol Reeves. She went by Reeves in the Bay, or sometimes just Reed, the way people's names compress over long deployments until only the essential sound remains. The men who knew her well, the ones who had seen her work, called her something else. A call sign that had followed her for years, earned on a night she never talked about, on an airframe she had held together with improvised fixes and raw knowledge while the aircraft was still airborne and the crew chief position was technically not supposed to be occupied by someone doing what she was doing. They called her Iron Hands, but none of the men in that forward maintenance bay on that particular afternoon knew any of that, not yet. The bay itself was a wide, low-ceilinged structure at the edge of a forward operating base, in a part of the world where the heat came through the corrugated metal walls even before the sun was fully up, and where the helicopters parked in 2 rows under the fluorescent lighting looked simultaneously immaculate and exhausted, the way working aircraft always do. They are maintained to a standard that borders on reverence. Every surface clean, every fastener torqued, every system checked and rechecked, and yet they carry in their rivets and their rotor heads the memory of everything they have ever been asked to do. You can see it if you know how to look. Hairline stress marks, the slight discoloration of metal that has run very hot very many times, the particular worn smooth quality of handles and panel latches that have been opened and closed 10,000 times by hands that needed to move fast in low light. Carol Reeves knew how to look. She had been looking at aircraft like these for nearly 2 decades. She was in her mid-50s. Her hair was cut short and practical, more gray than anything else, worn the way a person wears their hair when they have long since stopped thinking about it as anything other than something that needs to stay out of the way. Her hands were what you noticed first, if you were paying attention, which most people in that bay were not. They were the hands of someone who had spent years working in confined spaces, removing and reinstalling components in the dark and in the cold and in the kind of ambient noise that makes it impossible to hear yourself think. The knuckles were scarred. The fingers moved with a precision that was entirely habitual, the kind of precision that stops being conscious and becomes part of the body's grammar. She was wearing a contractor's vest over work clothing, no insignia, no unit patch, nothing to indicate who she had been or what she had done. Just the vest, the tools, and the aircraft. She had arrived at the bay that morning before anyone else. She had signed in with the maintenance officer on duty, a quiet young warrant officer who had glanced at her credentials and waved her through without much ceremony. She had taken a position at the far end of the bay, pulled her diagnostic kit, and begun working her way through a problem that had been grounding the aircraft for 4 days. 4 days. On a forward base with active mission requirements, 4 days is a very long time. 4 days means missions delayed, extract windows missed, planning cycles disrupted, and the particular corrosive tension that builds in a unit when the tools they depend on are unavailable. The fault was intermittent, which made it harder. Intermittent faults have a way of hiding, of presenting just long enough to be logged and then disappearing before anyone can chase them, like a word you know perfectly well until the moment you need it. The fault in question was hydraulic. It appeared as a pressure irregularity on the primary hydraulic system, brief and non-repeating, not severe enough to trigger a hard grounding on its own, but persistent enough, and in a system critical enough, that the senior maintenance officer had grounded the aircraft pending resolution. The 3 Army mechanics assigned to the aircraft had been working the fault for 2 days. They were good mechanics. They had followed the technical manual procedures methodically, replacing components, running tests, clearing and rerunning diagnostics. The fault had not been reproduced. The aircraft had not been cleared. Carol Reeves had been brought in from a contracting outfit that specialized in legacy airframe support. She had been asked to take a look. She had agreed. She had not said much else. By the time the Rangers arrived, she had been in the bay for 3 hours. And the count is still rising, which is how Rangers tend to arrive when they are unhappy. A compact formation of physical competence and barely leashed frustration. There were 8 of them, full kit minus weapons, the kind of presence that rearranges the geometry of a room simply by existing in it. Their team sergeant, a big man named Garrett, with a neck like a load-bearing column and a face that had been broken and reset at least once, scanned the bay with the particular expressionless assessment of someone who has spent years professionally evaluating situations and deciding whether they are acceptable. He decided the situation was not acceptable. The mission was a delayed extract. The window was still open, barely, but the aircraft were grounded, and the maintenance team was telling him they needed more time, and more time was not something he had to give. He walked the bay with the maintenance officer, asking questions in a flat, controlled voice, getting answers he did not like. The other Rangers spread out in the way men spread out when they are waiting and are not good at it. Some sat on equipment cases, one stretched. One stood near the far end of the bay, near where Carol Reeves was working. His name was Specialist Conley. He was 23, which is not an excuse, but is a fact worth noting. He was large, had been athletic since high school, had an older brother who was also Ranger tabbed and from whom he had inherited a somewhat inflated idea of what his presence in a room meant to the people in it. And he had been awake for 19 hours. The mission had been pushed back twice. He was, in the particular way of young men in high-stress environments who have run out of patience, looking for somewhere to put his frustration. He found it at the far end of the bay. He walked up behind Carol Reeves, who was crouched in front of an open panel on the aircraft's lower fuselage, running a penlight along a junction block with the slow, methodical care of someone who is reading something very complicated in very small print. He stood there for a moment. She did not look up. He stepped forward and opened the tool cabinet mounted on the wall directly to her left, the one she had positioned herself adjacent to in order to have the tools she needed within arm's reach. The cabinet door swung out and struck her shoulder. She looked up then. He was already reaching past her, pulling a wrench from the rack. He glanced down at her the way a person glances down at an obstacle, a bag left in the middle of the floor, a chair pulled too far from a table. "You mind?" he said. It was not really a question. Carol Reeves moved slightly to one side to give him room. He took the wrench. Then he paused. Something in the situation, the fact that she had moved so easily, the fact that she was still crouched at the panel, the fact that she was clearly working on the aircraft, worked on him in a way that called for a statement. "Look," he said. His voice had the particular quality of someone who is about to explain something obvious to someone who should already know it. "I don't know what you're contracted to do here, but the maintenance team has this. They don't need someone else getting in the way. Let the men work." He went back to his team. Carol Reeves watched him go. Then she set down the penlight. She stood up. She moved 2 steps to the right and stood with her back against the bay wall, arms at her sides, and watched the maintenance team work. She said nothing. The 3 mechanics worked steadily. They were doing what they had been doing for 2 days, following the fault tree, testing components, running system checks. The aircraft did not clear. The hydraulic pressure reading came back clean on every test, which was exactly the problem. Because intermittent faults in hydraulic systems that come back clean on bench tests but present in operation are almost always located in a component or a junction that the test sequence does not adequately stress. The mechanics knew this. They were looking. They had replaced 2 suspect lines, retested 2 check valves, and retorqued the entire primary junction block. The aircraft was still grounded. 40 minutes. That was what Sergeant Garrett told the maintenance officer. 40 minutes before the mission window closed definitively, and the extract timeline collapsed entirely. The maintenance officer looked at his team. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the time. Then the bay door opened, and Chief Warrant Officer Dabrowski walked in. He was a lean man in his early 40s, the kind of lean that comes from years of irregular meals and consistent physical demand, with the particular composure of senior warrant officers who have been operating in special operations aviation long enough to have seen nearly everything and have developed a very accurate sense of what a situation is. He had come from the TOC, where he had been in the planning cycle for the extract mission and had received the update on the aircraft status and had decided to come to the bay himself. He walked in and looked at the grounded aircraft. He looked at the maintenance team. He looked at the clock on the bay wall. Then he looked at the far end of the bay, where Carol Reeves was standing against the wall with her arms at her sides. He stopped. He looked at her for a moment, the way a person looks at something that does not fit the picture they were expecting, and then his expression changed, very slightly, in a way that was difficult to read, but was something in the range of recognition and something else. Relief, perhaps. Or the particular calm of a man who has just realized that the problem is solvable. "Iron hands," he said. His voice carried across the bay. Not loud, just clear. Carol Reeves looked up. "Why aren't you on the aircraft?" he said. She looked at him. Then she looked, very briefly, very precisely, in the direction of Specialist Conley, who was sitting on an equipment case 20 feet away. It was not an accusatory gesture. It was simply a statement of fact, the way a technician might indicate a faulty component. There it is. That is what happened. Dabrowski took that in. He nodded once, slowly. He looked at Conley. Then he looked back at Carol Reeves. "Get on the aircraft," he said. She picked up her penlight. She picked up her diagnostic kit. She walked back to the panel she had been working on and crouched in front of it and went back to reading the junction block with the same slow, methodical care she had been exercising before. No anger, no acknowledgement of the interruption, no performance of return. Just work. Dabrowski watched her for a moment. Then he walked to where the 3 mechanics were working and stood beside them in silence, watching. They briefed him on what they had checked. He listened. He asked 2 or 3 questions. Then he turned and watched Carol Reeves. She had the pen light in her left hand and a small dental mirror in her right, the kind of mirror on a telescoping handle that is used to see around corners and into spaces where a direct line of sight is not possible. She was moving the mirror in a slow, precise arc, not looking at the component directly in front of her, but at something behind it, in the space behind the junction block where the hydraulic lines ran back into the airframe structure. 8 minutes. Sergeant Garrett came to stand beside Dabrowski. He did not say anything. He just looked at the clock, and then at the aircraft, and then at Dabrowski, and Dabrowski held up one hand, very slightly, a gesture that meant wait, and Garrett, who had been in enough situations to know when to let a man work, waited. 9 minutes. 10. Carol Reeves stopped moving the mirror. She held it very still, angled at something behind the junction block. She reached into her kit without looking and removed a small, high-powered inspection light, one of the ones with a narrow focused beam that can illuminate a very small area with very high intensity. She directed the beam along the mirror. She looked at what it showed her. She set down the light. She set down the mirror. She reached into her kit again and removed a small section of flexible probe, a fiber optic line attached to a viewing eyepiece, the kind of tool used to see around corners into spaces that a mirror cannot reach. She fed the probe into the space behind the junction block, rotated it a quarter turn, and looked through the eyepiece. She looked for about 4 seconds. Then she sat back on her heels. "There," she said. It was the first word she had spoken since she had said nothing at all. Dabrowski crossed the bay to her. He crouched beside her. She handed him the probe eyepiece without comment, and he looked through it. He was silent for a moment. "How did nobody see that?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Panels listed as inspected," she said. 3 cycles back. Nobody opened it. The fault was a microfracture in a hydraulic line junction, a point where 2 lines met in a formed fitting that had been in service for 6 years and had accumulated stress in a way that was not visible from the outside and not accessible from any standard inspection point. The crack was hairline, less than a centimeter, located at the back of the fitting where the line made a slight bend before passing through a structural bracket. Under normal operating conditions, at ground pressure, the fitting behaved normally. Under flight loads, when the hydraulic system was at operating pressure and the airframe was flexing with the normal dynamics of flight, the crack opened fractionally, not enough to cause an immediate failure, enough to create a pressure drop, intermittent, unrepeating on the ground. Invisible to the test sequence, because the test sequence never reproduced flight load conditions at that junction. It had been there for 3 maintenance cycles, invisible, listed as inspected, because the panel that gave access to it had been checked for external condition, and the external condition was fine. No one had opened it. No one had looked at the fitting behind the bracket with a fiber optic probe angled at the specific orientation required to see the back of the junction. No one, until now. She replaced the fitting. It took her 22 minutes, working steadily in the confined space with the unhurried competence of someone who has done this in worse conditions, with worse lighting, and less time, and more at stake. She torqued the replacement fitting to spec. She reinstalled the panel. She ran a system check. The aircraft cleared. If stories like this one mean something to you, you can help keep them coming on Patreon. The link is right there in the description. The maintenance bay was very quiet. It had been the kind of quiet that gathers gradually, the way weather gathers, as each person in the room successively stopped what they were doing and turned toward the aircraft and watched Carol Reeves work and began, independently, to arrive at the same conclusion about what they were watching. It was not a dramatic quiet. It did not arrive all at once. It built, increment by increment, as the minutes passed and the probe went in, and the finding was made, and the tool was changed, and the work continued, unhurried, precise, complete. Sergeant Garrett looked at the cleared aircraft status on the board. He looked at the time. He had 6 minutes inside the window. "Dabrowski," he said. "Yeah," Dabrowski said. "We're good? You're good." The Rangers began their pre-mission sequence, the efficient, habitual movement of a team that has done this enough times that the sequence happens without being directed. Garrett spoke briefly on the radio. Aircraft crew began spinning up. The bay doors opened on the far end. 63,000 people are waiting on the other side, and the count is still rising. Looking at the bay, looking at the aircraft, looking at Carol Reeves, who had repacked her diagnostic kit and was writing something in her maintenance log with the same systematic economy she brought to everything else. Then he turned to the room, which still contained the 3 mechanics, the maintenance officer, and specialist Conley, who had come back to stand near his team and was watching with an expression that had lost most of its certainty and had replaced it with something else, something that had not yet settled into a recognizable shape. Dabrowski spoke in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who is not angry but has decided that something needs to be said. "For the people in this bay who did not know who they were looking at," he said. He paused. He was not performing. He was giving the words room. That woman spent 14 years as a 160th SOAR crew chief, the 160th Night Stalkers, 7 combat deployments, Afghanistan, Iraq, a 3rd location I am not going to name. She flew more than 4,000 flight hours on rotary wing in special operations support roles, 2,000 of which were on this specific airframe type. She has a maintenance qualification rating that requires you to have personally completed more than 800 hands-on repairs to this class of hydraulic system to sit for the exam. She passed it on the first attempt. He let that sit. She has personally maintained aircraft that flew direct action missions. She has done emergency in-flight repairs while the aircraft was airborne. She was on the crew of a helicopter that was struck by small arms fire over a target in 2009, and she kept that aircraft flying for 47 minutes on a hydraulic system that should have failed in the first 3. The aircraft made it back. The crew made it back. He looked at Conley, not with anger, with the particular quality of attention that is worse than anger because it is precise. The fault that grounded this aircraft was present for 3 maintenance cycles. 3 qualified mechanics worked it for 2 days and could not reproduce it. She found it in 11 minutes with a fiber optic probe and a mirror. He looked around the room. 11 minutes. The number fell into the silence of the bay. She is here as a contractor because she retired from service, and we bring her in when we have problems we cannot solve with the people we have, which tells you something about how rare her knowledge is. It also tells you something about how we should be treating the people in this bay whose names we do not know. He looked back at Conley. "Any questions?" Conley said nothing. His jaw was set, but his eyes had gone somewhere private, somewhere a person goes when they are reviewing a sequence of events and arriving at a judgment about themselves that they would prefer not to arrive at. There were no questions. Carol Reeves heard all of it. She did not stop writing in her maintenance log. She finished the entry, dated it, signed it with the flat, practiced signature of someone who has signed thousands of maintenance entries, and closed the log. She repacked the last of her tools. She picked up her kit. She walked past Dabrowski and nodded once, the nod of a person who acknowledges having been acknowledged and does not require anything further. She walked past the 3 mechanics, who stepped aside, which was not something any of them had planned to do, but which happened anyway, the body responding to a recognition that the conscious mind was still catching up with. She stopped briefly at the maintenance officer's desk, dropped off her paperwork, received a signature in return, and thanked him in the quiet, specific way she thanked people who had done their jobs correctly. She walked out of the bay into the flat, hard afternoon light. Behind her, the aircraft lifted. The mission window held. The extract went as planned. She was in her vehicle and on her way to the contractor's staging area before the rotors had fully faded from the air. She ate a meal she had packed that morning, sitting in the vehicle with the windows down and the sound of the bass around her. And if she thought about the sequence of events in the maintenance bay, she gave no outward sign of it, the way a person does not give outward signs of things that have already been fully processed and filed and placed in the appropriate category of experience. This had happened before. It would happen again. The details changed. The geography changed. The name of the person who said something dismissive in a room full of people changed. What did not change was the moment when the work spoke for itself, when the aircraft cleared, or the system came back online, or the fault that had defeated everyone else resolved under hands that knew where to look. That moment did not need commentary. It did not need an audience. It simply happened, like water finding the lowest point, like a gyroscope finding true. She drove back to the staging area in the late afternoon and handed in her equipment and wrote her post-mission report, and was back at her hotel by evening. She called her daughter. They talked about ordinary things. She slept well. Specialist Conley did not sleep as well. He was on the aircraft when it lifted, taking his position in the team for the extract mission, doing what he had trained to do, which he did competently and without incident. The mission went without complication. The extract was clean. They were back on base before midnight. He did not talk about the bay. He thought about it. He thought about it during the mission, in the particular way the mind works on unresolved things in the background, while the foreground is occupied with task and procedure. He thought about the woman crouching at the panel. He thought about the way she had moved without complaint when the cabinet door struck her. He thought about what he had said, the specific words, the specific delivery. He thought about the 11 minutes. He had been moving an obstacle. He had been certain of that. The certainty had been absolute, the kind of certainty that does not feel like an assumption because it feels like obvious fact, like knowing which direction is up. The woman at the panel was a contractor, civilian, older, in the way, taking up space that belonged to the people who needed to solve the problem. He had been certain. He had been wrong in a way that was not a matter of degree. He thought about what Dabrowski had said. He thought about 4,000 flight hours. He thought about 2009 and 47 minutes on a system that should have failed. He thought about the word iron hands and the way Dabrowski had said it. The way you say a name that means something. A name attached to a record, attached to things that happened in places you would have been afraid to be. He thought about the fact that she had said nothing. Not in the moment. Not afterward. Not when Dabrowski had delivered the full weight of what she was into the room. She had kept writing in her log. She had nodded once. She had walked out. She had not needed the room to know what had happened. He was not the kind of young man who carried himself easily through the recognition of being wrong. He had been built, by family and by experience, and by the particular culture of the units he moved through, to carry himself with confidence, and confidence, when it is worn as armor, rather than earned as knowledge, is brittle in exactly the way a hydraulic line junction can be brittle, fine under normal conditions, catastrophic under real load. He filed his post-mission report. He cleaned his equipment. He went to his bunk. In the morning, he went to the maintenance officer and asked for the name of the contractor who had been in the bay the previous afternoon. The maintenance officer looked at him for a moment, in the way a person looks at someone when they are deciding whether the request represents something good or something else. He gave him the name. Conley wrote a letter, not an email, a handwritten letter on paper, which was a choice that cost him something in the way that things cost you something when they are the right thing to do and you have never done them before. He wrote that he had moved her and told her to let the men work, and that he knew, now, what she was, and that his certainty had been in inverse proportion to his knowledge, and that he was sorry. He left the letter at the contracting liaison desk with a request that it be forwarded. He did not know if she received it. He did not know if she read it. He assumed she filed it in whatever category she filed these things in, and moved on. He kept the memory of the 11 minutes with him for the rest of his career. He did not always understand, in the moment, why certain things felt familiar until he worked back to it. A new mechanic, young, visibly nervous, a contractor with no insignia, a senior NCO who was quiet. He kept the memory of being wrong with perfect certainty, and he became, in time, a different kind of certain. Not the kind that is a feeling, the kind that is earned. Dabrowski told the story twice in the following weeks. Once to his warrant officer peers at a planning session when the conversation turned to contractor integration and the friction between assigned maintenance crews and outside specialists, and once to a group of junior aircrew officers during a professional development session on human factors in aviation maintenance. Both times, he told it the same way, without embellishment, without theater. He simply told what happened, in sequence, with the specific details that gave it its weight. The diagnostic kit, the fiber optic probe, the angle of the mirror, the microfracture in the junction behind the bracket that had been listed as inspected, the 11 minutes. He told them her call sign. He told them what it meant. He told them about 2009 and the 47 minutes. He did not tell it as a story about gender, or about justice, or about any of the categories that people tend to reach for when they are trying to give experience a shape that can be carried. He told it as a story about knowledge and assumption, about the difference between the two, about the specific danger of mistaking the absence of insignia for the absence of competence. The story spread, the way stories spread in the enclosed and information-dense world of a forward base, quickly and with the accretion of detail that stories gather as they move. Some details were wrong. The timeline expanded slightly. The number of mechanics grew. The mission window shrank. The fault became more dramatic in the telling. This is what stories do. They metabolize. What did not change, in any version, was the core, the woman at the panel, the man who told her to step back, the 11 minutes, the cleared aircraft, the lifted mission. The lesson, as it was passed to new personnel rotating through the base, as it was given to junior mechanics in maintenance briefings, as it was dropped into conversation by warrant officers and crew chiefs and team sergeants who had heard it from someone who had been there, was stated in different ways by different people. Some said it was about respecting contractors. Some said it was about not judging competence by appearance. Some said it was about the 160th and what 14 years in special operations aviation does to a person's knowledge of a specific airframe. All of those things were true. But the version that persisted, that got passed most faithfully from one rotation to the next, was simpler than all of them. You don't know what you don't know. The most dangerous gap is not between what you know and what the manual says. It is between what you know and what the quiet person at the far end of the bay knows, the one without insignia, the one who is crouching at an open panel with a pen light and a fiber optic probe, looking for a crack behind a bracket that is listed as inspected. That person might be nobody, or she might be Iron Hands. And the difference between those two possibilities is the difference between a grounded aircraft and a cleared one, between a closed window and an open one, between a mission that does not happen and 8 people getting home safely in the dark. The assumption costs nothing to discard. The mistake it prevents cannot be measured. Carol Reeves did not know, and would not have been particularly interested to know, that her name was being carried forward in these conversations. She was, in the weeks following, on a different base, working a different aircraft, tracing a different intermittent fault with the same methodical patience, and the same diagnostic kit, and the same hands that had learned their precision across a span of years that added up to something she no longer thought of as a service record, and had simply become the accumulated knowledge of how the work is done. She found the second fault in a morning. She filed her report. She moved on. She had always moved on. It was, she would have said, if anyone had asked her, the only productive direction. She was 63 hours into a new diagnostic sequence at a forward staging area in a different theater when a young crew chief, first deployment, came to ask her something. She looked up from the panel. He was standing respectfully at the edge of her workspace, tools in hand, with the careful posture of someone who is aware they may be interrupting. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. He asked about the junction fitting type she was working on. A technical question, specific and good. The kind of question that comes from someone who is paying attention and wants to understand, rather than just to complete the task. She answered it. She showed him the probe technique. She walked him through the angle of the fiber optic line that revealed the back of the junction where the standard visual inspection could not reach. He watched her hands. "How do you know where to look?" he said. She thought about it for a moment. "You look everywhere," she said. "And then you look in the places where everybody stopped looking." He nodded. He thought about that. He remembered it. Years later, he would tell a crew chief under his own supervision the same thing, and that crew chief would tell the next one, and the knowledge would travel forward through the chain of people who had learned it, each one carrying the sentence and the technique and the particular quality of attention that the sentence points toward, the willingness to open a panel that is listed as inspected, to shine a light in the space behind the fitting, to see what is there rather than what is expected. And the aircraft would clear, and the missions would go, and the people who needed to come home would come home. In the end, that is what the work is for. Not for the recognition, not for the room to understand what you are. Those things may come, or they may not come, and either way, the panel is open and the probe is in, and the fault is somewhere in there waiting to be found, and finding it is the whole of the matter, the whole of it. My name is Old Bill, and I have been collecting these stories because they carry something that matters, something that the loud rooms of the world are always in danger of losing. The knowledge that the most important person in any room is not always the one with the cleanest uniform, or the loudest voice, or the most visible authority. Sometimes it is the person in the contractor vest at the far end of the bay, the one who says nothing, the one who knows exactly where to look. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. And if you would like to help me keep telling them, you will find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.